Okay, it's my pleasure and honour to have not one but two head geeks with me today, Sasha Geese and Kevin Klein, who are joining us for a deep dive series in database personas, how this works, what they relate to in terms of database administration, and the tooling that's relevant for them. And my name is Mark Roberts. I'm the Technical Director here at Prosperon Networks. We are partners for SolarWinds in the UK and around the world. And for the last 18 years, my focus has been very much on SolarWinds and being what I refer to as an enterprise monitoring specialist. And with that, I'm very much here to help and guide our customers to put a good installation of SolarWinds and many other tools in place. Today, as I say, I have Sasha and Kevin. So my job here is really just to chair and let them speak. So first of all, I'll introduce Sasha. Sasha Geese, good afternoon.
Hi there, my name is Sasha and I'm one of SolarWinds head geeks. And yes, you're right, there's two of us in this session. And I'm the so-called international guy. So I deal with Europe, EMEA, overall, and APJ. And today I represent the IT generalist and maybe the accidental DBA. But then I leave.
Thank you very much for that, Sasha. I think that you're going to be doing more than that. You're very much more than the IT generalist. And Kevin, good afternoon. If you'd like to say hello and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I live in the beautiful city of Nashville, Tennessee, and I have been involved with databases since the mid-'80s. So I still kind of deep in my heart have a curmudgeonly belief that Fortran is the best programming language of all. And but I've been staying with relational databases since they were brand new. And I'm happy to be here today to kind of play the part of that expert DBA who spends a lot of time thinking about data and performance, as opposed to Sasha's more broad focus on keeping the whole infrastructure up and running.
And that's very much around these personas. It's identifying the fact that we have a DBA specialist and we have an IT generalist. The requirements and the function that you both provided in your careers are completely different. And this is very much what we want to talk about in this series. So from that point of view, you can see from our agenda, we're going to take you through, have a look at what we consider to be common personas. Clearly, there are many more, but the four that we have on here are things that we see in terms of how people are monitoring their environments, monitoring their databases, how those databases fit in to the services that they are providing functionality for. A little bit on Prosperon. So Prosperon are SolarWinds partners, have been for over 16 years. We provide a lot of functionality to our customers, pretty much handhold everybody from start to finish and make sure that they're getting everything they can. We've done a lot of good work across the board, and most of our work is around helping, let's say, with deployments, design improvements, and also more advanced functionality such as integration to third-party solutions, as well as including our managed services. Now, the database tooling, you can see from the slide that we have on the screen at the moment with regards to these four common personas. In my experience, and certainly working with the organizations that we do, there's lots of them of different sizes, flavors, public sector, private sector. What we are looking at achieving in this deep dive series is very much around the reality of how these users and these personas manage and have to manage and get involved in database administration. They all have different challenges, they all have different needs, and there's very much a different approach that's going to be necessary for each of them. So we're going to take this series to kind of have this deep dive insight into that, and certainly leverage the knowledge, expertise and experience that Sasha and Kevin can bring to demonstrate, let's say, that tooling definition. Now, Kevin, Sasha, from your point of view, I'm interested to hear kind of your stories about how you both first got involved in database management. Certainly from a IT generalist, that kind of first one that we're going to be talking about, this accidental DBA. Sasha, would you like to go first?
Well, I think my first personal experience was playing around with actually a SharePoint and wondering why things doesn't work. So I looked at the database, but it didn't really tell me anything back in those days. But obviously, starting at SolarWinds and dealing with customers basically 5 days in a week, there were loads of problems which we tried to solve with our tools, and they came to us with real world problems. And it's very nice if we were able to provide the tools to help themselves, basically. And that was kind of my angle where I came from. And meanwhile, I'm kind of like deploying SolarWinds in my own environment. And now I know a little bit more what a database does as opposed to a couple of years back with the SharePoint.
Yeah, and that certainly resonates with myself. My first exposure to databases was the fact that there was an application that needed a Microsoft SQL backend. Up until that point, I've been using Access. And so needing to manage and install this new application, get all of that configured, it needed to go against a database server. So that then opened my world to having to learn that application as well. Kevin, how about yourself, sir?
Well, I must be the oldest person in the room here, since I started at a time when a 286 was the leading edge technology in those days. And you were thrilled to have 512 kilobytes of RAM, very, very different times back then. And kind of at the cusp of the decline of mainframe computing. And so I learned how to administrate labs. I was a lab administrator at one of the computer labs at college. And in college, I learned Fortran and was very good at it. And I also was a little bit more forward thinking than some of my colleagues who only learned what they had to in class. I had independently decided to learn about these new relational databases. And so I was able to combine those two skills of knowing how to write a select statement, which was very new in the mid-'80s, and also being able to use Fortran code to write conditional processing for SQL statements, because I hadn't invented stored procedures yet. And so I was able to parlay that into a job at NASA. And so I worked on the team that built the water recycling system that's in use in the International Space Station today. And that was the start of my career. For the first 6 years, I was primarily a developer. So I wrote a lot of front-end code and a lot of back-end code. And then in the early 90s, I moved to one of the big 4 accounting and consulting firms of the world, and started to work on the relational database systems there, and led the SQL Server team for many years as well. So working at very high-end, for the day, high-end database applications throughout my career. And one of the things I discovered all through those early years was that there were very few good tools for managing database systems. And so later on in my career, that became one of my passions, is to think of myself as a senior DBA and think about what kind of tools can we create to make this person more effective and more capable. So I've been in the tools industry ever since the early 2000s.
Fantastic. I don't think we can compete with first job being at NASA. Sasha, no? No.
Well,
okay.
I can throw in Activision Blizzard, but it's not NASA.
That's pretty cool, actually. Yeah, and I love your dedication to carrying that on in your personal life as well with your gaming. Fantastic. Well, thank you both for that. And what we're carrying on in our series of our database personas, today we are looking at those full-blown, the clever people, the full DBAs, how the tooling is used by them, how that improves their work life, and how the tooling can really make their difference in terms of what they do on a day-to-day basis. So what we're going to do with this is very similar to what we've been looking at before, is having an understanding about these personas. With a full DBA, why is this persona different? What do they do differently? What tooling differences exist that are going to, as I say, help them with their work? And we're going to use a demonstration. So this one's going to be very much around the SQL Sentry solution from SolarWinds. We've already discussed that the other solutions that exist in the portfolio fit very nicely into these other personas. And please have a look at those videos to kind of see how they work and the differences that get applied. And so what we're going to be talking about today, as I say, is the tooling, the differences, how they deal with things like HA, automation. You can see here we've got a whole library of capabilities and functions that this person is going to be responsible for, and the tooling is going to ease, improve, and make that all a far more efficient process for them. Now, these DBAs are the real hardcore end, slightly mad end of the engineer spectrum, if you might say. And these are employed by an organization to ensure that these really critical databases are running well, that when they're not running well, that they get dealt with very quickly and efficiently. When you have an organization that is spending the sort of money that a full DBA earns, there is a reason for that. And that is because of the criticality and the quality of the data and the database service that feeds into the business. So these are knowledgeable, very capable people and have very specific needs. So with the knowledge that these people have, why is tooling so important, Kevin? What's the difference between running their own scripts and executing DMVs? What would be the difference for you?
There's a threefold difference. The first is that enterprise DBAs typically are responsible for a much larger number of databases. So it could be a heterogeneous mix, not just of SQL Server, but it could also be Oracle, Postgres, MySQL, that sort of thing. But it's very, very common to find a SQL Server estate of many hundreds of instances of SQL Server on premises or in the cloud. So much more servers to keep an eye on. And that scale alone is difficult to sustain. And that's one thing that tooling enables you to do, is that you can monitor more and keep an eye on more without actually having to hire many more DBAs to do that amount of work. So that's the first difference. The second difference is that they also often access many more kinds of services related to SQL Server. You might also use reporting services and integration services and analysis services as well. You want to capture that full range of value that you can with the full stack of Microsoft features. You might also take advantage of feature sets like availability groups for high availability and disaster recovery. And I said you might also, in fact, it's probably guaranteed at the enterprise level that your business critical systems are going to have that kind of live secondary server waiting to take over if anything bad happens. So there are other kind of more intricate or more elaborate feature sets inside a SQL Server that we also need to keep an eye on. What's happening with our storage, right? Maybe we're connecting back to various SAN appliances. So we need to see what's happening there. We need to see what's happening with that high availability and so forth. And then the third is that a tradition among enterprise DBAs is what we call the blame game, where someone calls up and says, I blame you for my outage. And as a DBA, our response is, well, let's see what the outage really is. And it might turn out to be yeah, exactly. In fact, I always joke that the network admins were my nemesis when I was enterprise DBA. But it could be the network, it could be DNS servers, or it could be Active Directory that's causing people to have difficulty connecting to their SQL servers. So the final thing we wanted to include inside of SQL Sentry was this full stack observability. So we have a situation where we have at the bottom of the stack, we have the operating system, and then we have a layer of virtualization. So it could be Hyper-V or VMware. And then we have the SQL Server itself, and many things inside of SQL Server that might be our root cause of the problem. Memory issues, CPU, IO, and what have you. So that's one of the things you'll see as well when we take a look in the demo in a moment. There's a lot of information, and that's because you are fighting the blame game, and you want to be able to tell very quickly if this is my problem or if it's something I can hand off to another team inside the organization. And again, as an enterprise DBA, it shows a little bit of my selfish and mean side, in which I took great pleasure that I could throw the problem over the fence to a different team. It's the SharePoint team's problem. You guys go deal with it.
Yeah, but the thing with that, and certainly the thing that I raise a lot with customers is, rather than, and our reference, I don't know if this travels in terms of the US and internationally, but it's that hot potato. It's just throwing that hot potato from one team to another and saying, well, it's not me, it's going to be your issue. But actually just throwing that potato quite blindly, and it's the network team. It's never the network. It's the storage team. Well, it's often the storage. But those kind of things, it's having the information to say, well, actually, where am I going to throw this hot potato? If I've got the knowledge and visibility and understanding about what's going on from disk through the storage, through the virtualization, through the cloud, whichever the environment is, then if I can observe and identify, then when I hand that over, I'm doing so with intelligence. I'm giving them a lead in to say, it's not my problem. I've looked at my systems. This seems to be okay. But here, I'm seeing high I/O on the storage layer. Can you have a look? And it's sent to the SAN team.
That's a great point to bring up, Mark. And one thing that surprised me when we rolled out some of these newer full stack features was that we don't license by the thick client. We license by the different servers that you monitor. And so we had customers coming back and saying, well, our VMware team is really excited about the empirical evidence we had, which they could not collect themselves. Can we let them have this console as well so that they can see the VM performance and issues like that? And we said, well, sure, it's not licensed by the client. Give it to as many people as you want. And they would huddle up and they're like, okay, so we're going to give that to the SAN team. We're going to give it to the VM team. And so it's, as you mentioned, it is very thorough, gives you great information. And so we have encountered situations where our DBAs were, kind of crowing, rightfully so, that they had more information than the other teams they work with frequently. And so that's a good place to be in, especially as a data person. You love to have all the data.
What we see on this level is that someone working as an enterprise DBA has loads of experience. And if stuff is going wrong, those folks usually have a good idea what exactly is going wrong. But what they probably miss is a way to prove it. And you need to be able to prove it before we go to your hot potato mode, right? So I think SQL Sentry is a great tool that you actually gain all that visibility and you see it black on white. No, it's white on black, white, whatever. And you actually see it. You actually see it, and that's proving your point. That's very important.
Yeah, and Sasha, what I was going to say to yourself there was when we were going through the SolarWinds Orion observability platform, those teams may already have knowledge. If they're monitoring their SAN within that tool and they're monitoring the virtualization in the monitoring platform, the DBAs should be going to those people and having these conversations because they've done the observation. But then those teams should be in the position because the tooling has already told them for their environment, there's a problem, and they should be kind of turning around and going, yeah, we know, we're on it. We see that there's a problem on the LUN that's mapped to the data store that provides the database service.
Yeah, so I don't want to blame the network team because it never is the network. But let's say the SysAdmin team, they might not be able to connect the dots without expert insights coming from Sentry in this example.
Indeed, and we see it used in NOCs, national or operation centers. And so again, a lot of times those operators are generalists. So they're like, I know that's wrong, but I don't really know what it means. So that's another value add when you have these tools.
Yeah, and you already touched on it previously, Kevin. The information that we get out and bringing that information to the eyes of people, whether it's the front tier 1 service desk that may be just doing the triage, and then they will do the directional thing to say, okay, I've got some information. I can see from the multi-stack tier complex application structure that they have. Okay, I'm going to send it off to the network team. Sasha, let's carry on that theme. It's never the network. But in that sense, having that information, and the tooling is all about providing that information and giving that insight into what's going on. And then the DBAs, when it comes onto their shoulders and they're looking at these issues, that tooling then reinforces their ability to confirm, remediate, understand in a much more appropriate and efficient manner.
And to your earlier point as well, in which many enterprise DBAs do have very extensive collections of scripts. And so it is possible to get much of the same sort of information about what's happening on your SQL servers through running smart scripts. But again, I moved into the tools industry from being an enterprise DBA at a time when scripts were mostly the only thing that you had. In the 90s, we didn't have a lot of monitoring tools. And I can tell you from personal experience that the biggest issue with running a script-based sort of way of looking at your enterprise and its health is not so much writing that first edition of your scripts. It's 4 years after you started and a whole new version of the database platform has come out with major changes. That kind of longer term maintenance is where it becomes very, very difficult to maintain your own kind of private repository of queries and health checks and things like that. So, as my enterprise grew over time, I found that it was very much like what we have with the crafts, the trade industry skills, of carpentry and woodworking, or, the right tool for the job is very, very important at these enterprise levels. If you have something that you built yourself, well, it's kind of like if you were a woodworker or a plumber or a contractor who builds your own tools. At some point you're going to say, maybe I should buy a professional tool from one of these companies that specialize in making great tools, simply because the value that you get for it is worth dozens, hundredfold. It's a huge multiplier in terms of your ability to get work done and add value to the business. So when you're spending all your time writing scripts, as many expert DBAs do, you're not actually making any of the applications that are being deployed better, right? It's kind of like building the ship while you're sailing it. You're not going to get the maximum of either of those, of building the ship or of sailing the ship. You need to be able to use a tool that enables you to focus on what's important to your business, which is adding value, improving your applications, perhaps performance, making sure that things are running smoothly.
Yeah, and it's taking that capability to that point where it is self-managing, and when it's needing that manual intervention, that immediacy of knowledge and function is there to allow you to put that into place much quickly. So from this point, it'd be great to go and have a look at an application. I know we're going to be concentrating on the SQL Sentry application today. Before we kind of go into that, what was the big driver between the SQL Sentry being really the focal point for a full DBA versus what we've seen previously in the other personas where DPA was very much the suggested and recommended tool?
So DPA is, first of all, it's broad and heterogeneous. So that means you can see the exact same interface for DB2 and Postgres and SQL Server and Oracle. And that's extremely valuable, especially if you don't have time to skill up to an expert level in all of those different platforms. That's the first thing. The second thing is DPA uses a weight statistics approach to telling you how things are performing. And this is extremely valuable in terms of internal behaviors of a database, okay? And most of the time, that's what we need to know. And that is the biggest factor on performance, okay? It'll tell you anomalies. So it says, oh, I've been watching this database for a while, and I know that these kinds of queries normally happen, but suddenly we have a lot of locking today. Okay, so that's abnormal. Those are extremely powerful and very, very valuable features. Moving to SQL Sentry, though, what we have is a situation where we watch not only the weight statistics. When we look at the dashboard, we'll see that there's a similar kind of graph for weight statistics, but it's only maybe 1/8 the real estate on the total dashboard screen. So what we have is full stack observability on SQL Sentry. So one of the things, for example, that DPA won't be able to do is it won't be able to tell you if there is that server level problem, right? There's DNS errors going off or Active Directory problems and things like that. Whereas SQL Sentry is designed to give you everything. That's a hard trade, though, because if you're a new or intermediate skilled person, you might look at that and be overwhelmed. And so that's one of the challenges we've encountered with our customers who didn't know what key lookups were, for example. So they're like, okay, I see that that's really spiking, but I don't know what to do with that. So there is quite a bit of features built in to help explain what different alarms and dashboards and things like that, graphs might be. But the term I like to use is it is a very sophisticated tool. Some people use more derogatory terms like complex, but or difficult. But in my case, it's sophisticated, and it takes a little practice to get used to it. But then once you're used to it, it's kind of hard to do without all that great information.
But then that suits this persona. They are experienced.
That's right.
You are not a DBA in your first couple of years in the IT industry. So by that stage, you should have the level of capability to take on board a more advanced tool that's fit for your purpose and your function.
And in fact, that's one of the biggest reasons we've had customers leave a different monitoring product and come to SQL Sentry. Is they said, well, when I started, I didn't know much. And so that entry level, and I'm not talking about DBA, but other competitors in the market, that entry level tool didn't take me as far as I needed to go. It was useful in those first 2 years I used it, but once our contract was up, I knew I needed to look for a more powerful tool that could tell me more. And so that's what brought us to SQL Sentry. So we see that a lot. There's kind of an aspirational aspect to it in which people know they should know these things, and they want to know these things. And so once they gain those skills, they make the switch.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump in and have a look at it, shall we?
So what we're looking at here is the start page for SQL Sentry. And the idea for the start page is that as an enterprise DBA, there are times when you just want to have an idea of how healthy things are overall across your enterprise. Now, this isn't a terribly big estate of SQL servers. You can see we have about a half dozen SQL servers here on the left-hand side. Coventry SQL, there's London SQL, and so forth. There's one in Washington State, Redmond SQL. And so the idea here is I want to quick glance to see what is happening. And I can choose, first of all, what the time period is here. So for the last 24 hours, I want to know what my enterprise health score is. It's called the Enterprise Health Overview. And this tells us, actually 67 is not terribly bad. You might think in terms of being graded in school on a scale of 1 to 100, and that you need to get close to 100. 67 is kind of a typical number in the 60s and 70s for most enterprises. And so there's two ways you can see across all of your servers at a very quick glance the severity of errors in this first little set of pie chart kind of numbers. So we see we do have 313 high severity alerts that have gone off in the last 24 hours, 385 medium ones. And then the second pie chart over here is by category. So we see that CPU is the largest number, nothing much happening on network or memory, and then other, which could be I/O, it could be maybe an OS error or something like that. Now, that's the first thing we can see. And if you click on any of these, then this set of information below here, this is all the alarms of the various types that are happening at this time. So let's make this a little bit bigger and get a little more real estate here. And so you can actually just see right here a drop-down list of all of the different alarms. So let's say we wanted to see what was happening in terms of these CPU alarms here. If we click this, it just filters all of the different alarms that are going off here. And we can see that exactly what server they are, what kind of alarm it might be, high compiles, for example, pending disk I/O count. We see that there are things like CPU issues, context switches. And then if you prefer, you can jump right to the specific interfaces in SQL Sentry to find out, or even just close those particular situations. So this would take us right to the dashboard for that specific server, okay? And again, the idea is another request we get a lot from in the early days was people wanted a list of issues to work through. You know, what's happening right now that is significant and important. So that was easy to put together here, so you can see everything that's happening in your enterprise at a given time frame. Let's turn off CPU there. And so you can see all the different issues that might be happening. You can also tell just at a glance here in your hierarchy of objects on the left-hand side that some of these are showing red. So that also means that there is an event alert going off on that particular server. Okay.
So, Kevin, what I'm seeing here is that multifaceted approach to this dashboard. You've got the kind of here and now, what's going on in the last X period, maybe the last hour. That's going to be my focal point as I work through the day. I've got this last 24-hour one where it's probably my morning checklist. It's what has happened since I was in the office yesterday that I need to look at before the day really begins and my databases really start being utilized. Is that a good overview of that, those distinct functions?
Right, very much so. So, and it's also intended to get you a little bit out of the mode in which, you know, in the old days, one of the first things DBAs did to start their day was to check all of the backups and make sure all your backups happened. Well, with this tool in place, you can say, unless I have an alarm saying it didn't happen, I can trust that it has. So you can skip those kind of routine checks that you always had to do in the past because this will do those checks for you. There's also one other way that personally I actually really like to look at the enterprise overall, this little view performance stats. And so if you're the kind of person who loves tables, you know, and you like to look at things in a tabular view, this is the same information, but exclusively through, you know, basically something like an Excel spreadsheet. And this is has reset to the last sample. So let's go ahead and go to the last day like our other screen had. And so we'll see there's a little bit of change here. And then there's another couple buttons over here on the right-hand side. I like to have this expand warnings enabled. And so what this does is this drills down on each of the different servers. And again, red is a high alert, orange is a medium, and so forth. So when we look at the different servers, we could see on the Redmond analysis server, if we scroll over, we could see that we have some cache eviction issues. We have some memory shrinkage. And so we have some problems with memory churning there for that analysis server box. So this is just another way to see quickly everything that's happening in your enterprise. And again, you might not use this ever at all, depending on your interests and the way you like to process information. But our idea here is that we would like to give you a surplus of information, more than what you might need off the cuff, and you can exclude what you're not interested in. So let's say, for example, we want to go deeper. We want to figure out something that's happening on one of these SQL servers. We could click on it over here on our navigator, or we could just click one of the buttons here that tell us, I'm going to take you directly to a specific window in the dashboard. Okay, so that's performance analysis. And when you click on these, notice that the time here, it'll take us to that exact point in time, so that we can begin a troubleshooting and remediation process if we need to. I'm not going to do that right now because I just want to take you through a little bit more of the interface. So let's go over here to the London SQL 01 SQL server. And this is the general dashboard here, okay? Perhaps you can see why some people say that this is a lot of information all at once. What we're really looking at here is kind of easy to decipher once you know what it is telling us. There's the vertical blue bar here in the middle. Everything to the left of that blue bar is all of the standard Windows performance counters that all sysadmins love, right? So here's how busy our network is on this side. We have CPU usage just below that. And as you go down, you see here's the memory usage for the SQL Server, and then we have disk I/O. So it's always a pleasure to see a DBA who says, I thought the database I/O was the issue over here on this side, and checking that information, but I see that my graph values aren't coming up so high. And I see that over on this side, I have a lot of disk I/O happening on the Windows side, more than what's happening in SQL Server. So you can tell kind of at a glance if there is a correlation between what we see in the database. Again, we've got SQL Server memory here, right? And is it the same? Does it correlate well with what we see on Windows memory versus SQL Server?
Yeah, and this is kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. This correlation of information and monitoring data. We have I/O at so many different levels, whether it's the application, in this case SQL, whether it's the OS, whether it's the guest, whether it's the host VM, whether it's the LUN, whether it's the storage array, whether it's the disk. All of those have I/O, and they're not always correlated. They're not always going to be the fact that on the bottom level it affects everything at the top. It could very much just be purely to do with SQL I/O and nothing to do with the OS and the physical hardware. So having those pieces of information side by side, you're saying complicated. I'm looking at this and going, this is clear. This is a clear separation of information. So I can look at this and I can correlate my metrics across these different tiers.
Exactly right. And in fact, we can be explicit about it and say, I want to make sure I know what's going on. So we can click and hold and then highlight. So I see a spike here on the Windows level disk I/O, and now we can see it actually highlights everywhere that we see that spike at the same time. So we see that there is, for the database, a similar spike over here. And so we know at a glance, okay, this is coming from SQL Server, definitely. The flip side is, for example, we had one customer I talked with in 2019, a very large logistics and shipping company here in the US. It made me laugh. It was a very 21st century problem. For some reason, things were getting slow at night. And so they turned on our product and found out right away that CPU was spiking on the Windows server, but not on the SQL server. And so one of the other options that we have up at the very top of the screen is to flip to a tab. If we look across here, you see there's disk activity, disk base, and so forth. So they flip to this tab called processes to see what all the processes that were happening at that time at a Windows level. And what they found was that somebody on the third-party hosting provider had installed a Bitcoin miner, and it kicked in at about 1 a.m. and ran till about 5 a.m. And so CPU was spiking, IOPS were going up, and actually taking so much resources away from SQL Server that it couldn't finish all of its preventative maintenance that was occurring at night, like backups. And so it made it instantly clear exactly what the problem was in that one specific scenario. Kind of crazy.
But it's true. As I say, I've had it. Different times have different things. That was Bitcoin. Previously, it would be things like torrents running out of hours because they were a bit more under that. But something there was causing an interactive issue affecting the running business level application.
Also very, very true. Another thing that folks like to see, and this is similar to what we have in DPA, is we want to know how normal is this. So we come with 3 built-in temporal baselines based on comparison to certain timeframes. So to see how this compares to the same time last week, we could click on the baseline, and then I prefer to see it by a range. Otherwise, you just see a small dotted line, but the range shows us what is the high end and the low end of normal values here. So here we can see for these are actually 2 specific problems. And so we want to keep an eye on key lookups. If you click on it, it'll highlight it, and forwarded records. So we can see that, sometimes forwarded records will be very high, and other times they'll be very low. Whereas if you just get the average, it might give you an impression there's a middling number of those all the time. So again, this tells us what is kind of the range of normal. And as a follow-on to that, we can set our alarms that are in this system to only alarm when things are outside of that normal range, or maybe one standard deviation from what's normal. Also notice here that there is a little alarm, right? And we see it in several places, and it correlates to these little dots at the bottom. If you hover over those little dots, it'll tell you what the problem might be having. If you click on the little alarm, it'll give you more detail and even information you can look up if you're interested in that. So for example, in this one, we see that we're having some issues with high average wait time per user session. So that means the latency overall is growing on the server and may be enough for you to actually look into this and perhaps do some troubleshooting and problem remediation. Now, the main interface of DPA is actually this window right here, SQL Server Waits. That is about this approximately the same thing as what you would see on the main interface there for DPA. And we have these different categories. These are kind of roll-up categories into buckets, CPU, memory, disk, and so forth. And you can adjust this. These are set in our kind of a settings database. And so you can go in there and add another one, for example. So let's say you have an application or a bunch of applications that have a lot of locks and you want to break those out. You can do that. You would just update that table, insert a new row, define what color you want, and now we have locks that would appear on your wait stats as well. Now let me go ahead and scroll up here, and I'm going to click this little button that says update in real time, continue to update as we go along. So we can see some things are scrolling by, right? There's one other interface. I personally don't use it much, but every now and then it becomes very helpful. When I see that I have a massive issue I need to deal with right now, sometimes I want to look at the values as they poll right here and now, rather than this kind of trend lines that we have, let's say for the wait statistics down here. So what I might do is click this button here that's called sample mode. And so what sample mode shows us is the number of, or the numeric values of all of these different queries that are pulling information back from the database. So you'll see that these values will change in just a moment. And notice that under the wait statistics, we have a lot more information. We've got extended events, we've got in-memory OLTP, we've got transaction log. So it gives us more detail about what is happening. We can see all the different kinds of buckets for memory. We can see all of the Windows allocations for memory over on this side for the system memory. And we can see things like context switches. We can see the number of active users over here on the right. So if we want to, oh, okay, we've got 53 users here. So you'll see this poll in a moment, and it'll refresh and tell us, you know, what were the values for this at the current moment. Again, that's a troubleshooting feature. I don't typically use it as often for just day-to-day usage. I prefer the historical view.
What you've shown there is, again, a number of different avenues into that knowledge. You've dragged and dropped over a time period, and we can see the correlation, and we've got the OS level, it's confirmed that it's on the database level, and in that wait stats area, I can immediately see that those spikes correlate with the impact on the disk, and they're going to be drilled down, and we can go into that further. The screen that you've just showed and everything around that baselining is kind of SQL Server Training 101, isn't it? Where what is the norm? What's a good number? What's a bad number for you and your usage, and getting that baseline in place. And also, this is not just an issue of, or something's broken and it's causing problems. If we haven't got a failed disk that's causing disk I/O or a misconfiguration, it's the fact that actually it's just got high usage. So all of these different metrics come together and allow you to turn data into that knowledge and information level, which then allows you to respond and remediate. Yeah.
Exactly, and it's all actionable too, right? So that's another key value that is hard with a lot of when you have a lot of information sources. Sometimes they're nice to know, but many times they really don't advance your ability to resolve a problem, for example. So the idea here is to give you actionable information as quickly and reliably as we can. Okay. So what do you think would be the first thing that someone would want to do when they see a significant spike in CPU or I/O? A lot of times the first question that people ask is, what is happening inside of the SQL server? What is the SQL query that's the problem? So what many people will say is, let's jump to top SQL, right? And so when we do that, we can see this takes us into the part of the interface that shows all of the different SQL statements that are happening at a given time. So we start by default here at the running queries, and we do see that one of them has some blocking occurring. That's why it's in red. But it's a very tiny query. It's not, maybe it hasn't done much lately. But sometimes what we want to do is say, show me everything that's run in the last few minutes, the time window that I was looking at. So we could jump over to the completed queries tab. We could also look at procedure stats and query stats. And this one is pretty useful as well, because sometimes when we're looking at running queries, and it's updated and dropped out a whole bunch of stuff. But sometimes when we're looking at running queries and we see that there was one in red, like we saw just a moment, it seems like that's what we should immediately start to remediate. And I'm not saying that's not true, but another thing that slips under our radar a lot is the death by 1,000 cuts sort of scenario, where you've got small queries, but they execute hundreds of times an hour or more in aggregate. And so that's what query stats tab is especially useful for. We can see right here how many times this particular piece of information or this particular query has executed and what its overall workload is. Then, as you could see at the bottom of the screen, we could do something like drill into the statement here, and we can see that it's part of a stored procedure. So we see the whole stack of this stored procedure. And so we can see also that this particular point right here is the more expensive part. And we have access to all the beauty that is Plan Explorer down here at the bottom, and can even click our hyperlink to go see the execution plan directly in Plan Explorer if we wanted to do that. So yeah, we can see that there's a full index scan happening on this particular table, and it's retrieving 6 million records. Well, we could probably do something to tune that up or make its performance a little bit better. So it's that sort of thing from top to bottom. We just took a look at the main screen. We looked at the dashboard. We saw a spike, and we said, okay, let's drill down on that. And then it took us immediately to not a single big query, but a small query that is running multiple times that's causing our issues.
And we can also see how consistent that is in that impact. It's some of those queries, they may have no problems, but then possibly that blocking query came in and then affected, and all of a sudden there was that impact across more queries than would normally be the case, hence baselining again being so critical.
Exactly, right. Now this little vertical blue bar, as I mentioned, everything on the left is operating system. Everything on the right is SQL Server. Now, just to mention this in passing, is if here in the upper left corner we see that this particular SQL Server is running on a Hyper-V VM, if this was showing as a hyperlink, then that would mean that we have all the VM host information. We could click on that. What happens then is when we go to that blue bar, a vertical blue bar in the middle, we'd have a second blue bar, and then we could expand that and open up all of the Hyper-V information. So we'd have on the far left, the Windows OS, in the middle, the Hyper-V host, and on the right, the SQL Server activity. So that would give us a very quick way to see if we were dealing with something like a noisy neighbor inside of the Hyper-V or VMware host. So that's a pretty neat feature.
That's 3 tiers on one screen, all
That's right.
with correlated metrics across them, especially when you do that drag and drop, which is just a huge time saver.
Yeah, it's crazy powerful. Yeah, it really is. So one of the things we talked about very quickly there in passing was these little markers that pop up. These are a kind of alert that we ship many of these special custom advisory conditions, and you can also write your own if you want to. You can see over here on the viewer, the navigator pane, that we have advisory conditions as well here, 250 of them in total. I'm not going to dive into all of those, but there are things that are much more sophisticated than simple things like CPU is greater than 80%. So you can have some very, very powerful capabilities. For example, you can see that some of these are specialized. So Amazon RDS, for example, high CPU for non-SQL Server processes. All right, that's pretty cool. But then you can even have things like calculations about, I want to know when there is an issue with schedulers. And so I need to know how many schedulers, because that number can be dynamic and change, how many are currently active. And as we see down here, we can see that there is, there's a little bit of math going on. So you could do some very sophisticated kinds of build your own alerts. They could even be business process alerts. For example, a user needs to respond to this within a certain amount of time, and they haven't done that. Then we also have what we call the traditional, normal, built-in alerts. So what we just saw were all the custom alerts. And now under this particular dropdown for conditions, we can see that we have conditions global. And that is important because you can set all kinds of conditions at whatever level of the hierarchy that you want. So it could be for all servers. It could be for production servers get one set of rules and alerts, and development ones are less so, right? So on this drop-down list, we see that there's a couple other kinds of conditions besides the advisory conditions, which are the custom conditions. For example, general conditions are all the things that you would normally expect a monitoring service to tell you about, like deadlocks, locking, and blocking. Another one is if any of the queries that are executing on my server are taking a very long time. Those are the general conditions. The fail-safe conditions are those related to high availability. And so has any of the different services on this SQL Server gone offline? I want to know about that. Or maybe has a availability group failed over from the primary to a secondary node. And then audit conditions are situations in which end users have done something that you want to know about. Maybe you want to keep track of if someone has added a new condition or something like that. So those are all built in and available to you. Let me actually go and choose a real condition for us to look at. So we'll look at general condition and we'll look at deadlocks. Okay. Now, what we'll see down here in the bottom is all of the settings for how we respond. So when we have said we want an alert, up above it said send to email. So we can specify who gets the email. And then we can say if there's additional filters, like I don't want to be notified between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., something like that. So we can set some conditions. We could set some filters. We could say only the production DBAs get this email, but at other times, dev team leaders get the email because it's a dev server. And then you can also control with great granularity exactly how it responds. So, do I want it to run a trace? Do I want it to send a specific message? I can edit this. I can use HTML, so it's very informative. So really, you have a very high-powered alerting and response system built right into the tool.
And that's critical. If you're sending alerts out big advocate of this. If anyone's ever seen our alerting webinars, the big thing there is about giving the information in a clear, concise way to the receiver. So if they're receiving on a ticket onto the help desk system or an email, we want to give them everything that they need to be able to immediately understand, determine what actions they need to take to go and remediate it. If we're giving them a simple, oh, this has happened, that's not enough. That's not, are they able to decide what they do? Are they getting out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning to go and fix it? Are they logging onto a monitoring system to go and get more information? All of that can be really problematic if you're not enforcing that with rich information.
And not only that, the inverse is also true. So if you're sending out messages for trivial situations, people begin to filter out that noise and begin to disregard those alarms. That's not a good situation to be in. It's only a matter of time before we see that the users ignore something that is actually very important. So now let's take a look at another kind of special use case. One of the things that can be quite powerful inside of Plan Explorer are some of the ways that we can look at things like disk activity, for example. So here we will see on that particular SQL server, up at the top, we see this is information coming out of the different databases. If it's stripy, it's a transaction log. If it's solid, it's a database file. And you'll even see situations where the SQL server is heavily saturated, where you'll see red here on the HBA, or maybe from the different disks going to the hardware bus adapter. You'll see maybe an issue with a specific disk itself. And when you click on any of these, you'll find at the bottom that it begins to give us additional information about that particular set of files. It gives us information about how much it's being used at a given time. So you can see quite a bit of additional deep dive information, and we provide that specifically because I/O is such a frequent issue inside of the inside of SQL servers, right? You know, it's not uncommon for our SQL servers to have I/O problems. Another one that is really cool is to look at our availability groups. Now, availability groups are organized by databases, so it's not as specific to a given server. It's more specific to the databases inside of the server. So now we'll open up our always on availability group management, and so we can see that we have by our WSFC nodes, we can see that we have a primary here. The double lines means that it's asynchronous rather than a synchronous data flow. And we can see the rate of data as it flows between the two different secondaries that we have here. And so when we click on these secondaries, we can see what the throughput is. We could flip over to the error log if there was any errors that had happened, if there were any failovers or replica state changes. And you can see at the bottom, we have additional information each time we do that. That's not the only way you can look at this. Again, we could have a dozen different databases on this view pointing to many different secondaries on many different servers. So we could take a look at it in several different ways by instances in the group matrix. We could look at it by nodes and then drill down from here if we wanted to do that. We could look at it by groups and replicas. We can see all the different availability groups that are currently in our environment. So we have a couple nodes and one primary, but it's not uncommon to see that this server here might have others as secondaries for specific databases. So these are just a single database, but other times we might have many databases on a given SQL server that is that's our focal point, and so we can look at it that way as well.
And so from a visual standpoint, the big thing I'm picking up here is certainly with that speed of the ant trail, if I can use that expression, that's going to confirm to me that I know what my normal kind of speed is, if you want to put it in those terms. And certainly a thing that from my involvement in resiliency in SQL Server is knowing how good the quality of that communication is. We're talking about data being sent across over a network to a secondary and tertiary and whatever other number of machines there are as part of that group, and seeing the speed of that communication determines, well, how well is it keeping up? If it's not processing that data and it's trying to send more and more, it's just going to back up and queue, and eventually it's going to fault.
Exactly right. Yes. Brilliant. Two other special case troubleshooting situations. I've already showed you one actually under the sample mode here. So one of the things that you can do that is a special case bit of troubleshooting is on your NUMA node usage. And so what we see here is every single CPU available to the SQL Server, and we can see how much is being used for Windows activities. Oh, and there it repolled. So we can see how much is being used for SQL Server and how much is being used for other activities on the Windows Server itself. So there's just a tiny bit happening here. And so this, again, is a powerful way to see what's happening. NUMA node problems, when they occur, are usually very difficult to figure out. But this particular interface makes it very easy to figure out if you have a imbalance between your NUMA nodes. And so it wraps up very quickly. You can say, oh, yep, I've got that. I need to make some adjustments to the way I have that configured. One other user interface that I don't use all the time, but when I need it, it's very helpful. And that is this bad boy right here, SQL Server Agent. A lot of times it gets overlooked because, you know, it's not a real person, but what it does is it schedules all of our different jobs and things like that. So if you want to, you can actually say open event calendar. And sometimes it's going to be way too busy because there's a lot of different things you can look for. For example, it will show, yeah, look at that, that's crazy.
Wow. Well, I'm looking at this, and the first thing that springs to my mind is the fact that a DBA is more likely to be pushing more into the SQL agent function because automatic workloads and adjustments, tuning, optimization that takes place, they're all going to be put into that service function. Is that right? And therefore being able to look at this and see how it's working and the output and the timings that it took, this is all part of this visual presentation.
Right. And so first of all, I'm going to switch to my favorite way of looking at this. So it's called the split view. And so here we have all of the, at the bottom, we have all of the different jobs and so forth that are happening over time. And I'm going to collapse that down. And up above, we actually see all of the jobs in an Outlook calendar style. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a 10-minute view so we can zoom in a little bit better here. Let's see. That's not quite enough information here. Let me go out to the 1 hour view. Scroll up a little bit in the calendar. So now this gives us a pretty good idea what's going on. First thing is, this isn't just SQL agent jobs. And you could do all kinds of filtering. If we go over here, over to the navigator, we can actually look at the event calendar over here, and you can see there's some different filters, like just tasks, if you wanted to see just your SQL agent jobs. But what we are seeing right now is all kinds of alarms that are happening. So this particular alarm, that's a deadlock that occurred at that time. We have another deadlock occurring over here, okay? We have a job right here that ran, and you can see in this, it looks like about a 3-minute time span, it finished. There was a little bit of headroom left. It finished and had a little time left. Over here, though, this update measure has red. So that's telling us it actually failed at some point. So there's many different alarms that you can see going on. Some will be Windows, like these are some Windows jobs right here, or I'm sorry, SQL agent job. But then there's another, they call them glyphs. There's another glyph that indicates if it's a Windows job. There's ones for top SQL. There's one, yep, here's a top SQL alarm right here. And so we can see what is happening. Now, this little indicator here tells us that there's more issues. This tells us there's multiple steps, and so we can see the different steps that are happening. So it's another very, very rich way to see what's happening on your SQL server and troubleshoot things that are normally really hard to troubleshoot. In this case, the main thing that's hard to troubleshoot is that if you have too many overlapping jobs, right? So by default, SQL Server does single-threaded backups. You can change that, but the default is single-threaded. And so it's very hard in many cases to see if you have overlapping backups, so many overlapping backups that they slow each other down. But with the event view, the event calendar, you can see that right away.
Can I ask a question on that event view? Because I'm seeing that kind of time slice in a different way. We've got on the screen at the moment, we've got this graphing approach. Mm-hmm. That event-driven one is bringing together things that SQL Sentry has found and observed, those weights, those problems. It's identified and is monitoring those defined and configured SQL Server agent jobs. It's also going to be putting in those timestamps for alerts that are generated. So where we've created an alert definition and we're saying, I want to actively look for this condition, that is also going to get injected into that event view.
Yes, by default, it's all included, but you can also turn all of those things off and build it to exactly your preferences.
Yeah, but the point where I'm coming from on that is the fact that we've got so many different avenues of impact, whether it's a job, whether it's the running of the function application, embedding these alert definitions in there to say, I am looking for specific things. I know when we were talking about in the DevOps persona, those elements around, well, okay, I'm going to start my testing phase now. And this is now going to give me my point in time reference to say, well, here is when I started. I want to have a look at everything in that time window to see what could have impacted, whether it's stuff that I was actioning myself as part of my application, or also that was executed and running on the database server that's part of other work activities and workloads.
Exactly.
So yes. That event view to me just fills in so many holes because I may not be able to see that on a graph. But what I can do when I'm looking at that in a calendar view, that correlation and that visualization of how those events are taking place at those times that are being told and brought to my attention for me without me having to work it out on a kind of linear graph in this fashion.
So just to your last point about event calendar, you can see here on the navigator that there are actually quite a few that are built in for you. So for example, if you only wanted to see failed backup jobs or blocking and locking sorts of issues, that's built in, and you can build your own as well. So let me throw this out. Sasha, if we were talking to an enterprise that said, well, both of these tools have really useful tool sets, features, I kind of would like to have them both, but not all for the same servers. Is there an answer to that?
As it happens, there is. I mean, we have seen that there is kind of an overlap. Actually, we have seen an overlap between monitoring tools, and we also have seen an overlap between personas at sometimes, right? So, and as we've seen for the enterprise DBA, I think we could also call this person like a Microsoft data professional. I think that is a good way to tag it. And if we look a little bit back, we learned about DBA and the strength of DBA. And I think, Kevin, you mentioned that even is that we support multiple platforms. And it is not so unknown that in many organizations we might see a lot of Microsoft SQL landscape, but for various reasons, there are other databases around too, and they're not going away. So to accommodate this, what we also have in our portfolio is actually the database insights. Now, the good news is that is not another product, so we don't have to walk through a demo again. This is actually like a bundle. It's a bundle that comes with both, with SQL Sentry and the DBA product. Okay, so this should should be hugely beneficial to the folks who have a multitude of different servers. And maybe, I think we discussed this too, maybe an organization who has just a handful of critical SQL servers and loads of maybe pre-production test servers, whatever. So you probably want to use the SQL Sentry part for the production servers, which are crucial to the business, and use the DBA overview for the lesser critical ones. That would be one use case for this, I think. And that is actually a bundle. It's called Database Insights, and brings basically the NOC level view from DBA and the deep knowledge from SQL Sentry in one package.
And when you buy these licenses in the Database Insights pack, you can use as many of the DBA licenses, many of the licenses for DBA as you like, or vice versa. You can use as many of the licenses for SQL Sentry as you like. So it enables you to do kind of have the best of both worlds.
So you're picking and choosing which databases you're running for SQL Sentry. So you may have a bundle of 100, and you may have 70% of that on SQL Sentry, 30% of that running on DBA. And clearly, as we saw on the other personas, this ability for DBA to integrate with the SolarWinds Orion platform, the SolarWinds Observability platform, and as you said there, Kevin, having that SQL Sentry for the really those mission critical, those key databases where the DBA is going to have full visibility and insight.
Exactly. You have important SLAs you have to support. You have obligations, right? RPO and RTO obligations for recovery. That's where you're going to want to lean in on SQL Sentry. But on the other hand, if you're interested in performance overall, how queries are doing, user satisfaction with the experience, then DBA is going to be an excellent solution to that set of features that you need.
The best of lots of worlds, because we discussed right at the very beginning, an organization may not have just one of those personas in the organization. They may have a full DBA, but under them they may have a junior DBA, and they may have the systems tools users and the service tests that need the different functionality that we've seen in terms of the SolarWinds SAM, the DBA functionality, and SQL Sentry. Having all of those tools in their toolkit is then going to fit within the organization in terms of knowledge, experience, capability, and also the self-development. We've seen that a user that's a junior DBA, we're proposing that DBA is the right tool for them. Whereas as they learn, as they use the tools to learn as well, we've talked about that very strongly, and they get their capabilities higher, then they may transition fully across the SQL Sentry, but they have access to it as part of that learning and development pathway. So options galore.
Options galore. And that's one of the areas where you, Mark, and your team can really provide an additional layer of very valuable assistance, right? How do I properly configure this? How do I make sure I have an arrangement of alerts that are meaningful and not noisy? These are all extremely valuable value-add services that Prosperon, Mark, you and your team provide to the end-user community.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly what we've done in this series of the database personas is just highlight common personas. But it's not a one-size-fits-all. It very rarely is. So from that point of view, we are absolutely here to help to identify what the right tool for the right job is going to be. So yeah, please reach out to us. We're here to help. We're here to help you through that trial process, to help you through the deployment process, and choosing the right solution for your needs and your requirements. Guys, thank you very much. Excellent demo today on that, Kevin. Just in terms of a wrap up on what we've been talking about, this is the last in our series, a series of 4, where we have gone through a number of personas from the starting point of that accidental DBA, that person that's kind of thrust onto the front line, don't really have the knowledge, don't really have the experience, and the tooling is there to help them. The tooling is there to help them identify the where, the why, the what, with guidance, with knowledge, with the ability to surface issues that they don't know how to surface themselves, through to a junior DBA. Somebody's learning their craft and can use the tools to, again, make sure that they're working efficiently, that they're working strongly for the roles that they have, whether it's a configuration function. Have we configured it right? Has it had a positive outcome? Your SQL Server agent jobs, are they processing in the right way and are completing in a timely fashion? All of that visibility is important. We've then moved on to the DevOps and the developer arena, where their requirements and how they get involved in the tooling and how the monitoring experts want them to get involved in the tooling is critical for that. The capabilities to be able to determine the code that they're writing, is it going to break, is it going to make, is it performant, all of those understanding things, building it into the test cycles, again, is critical as part of their life cycle for build and for deployment and ongoing production analysis. And then today's session, which has been for me a really strong one, is taking that elevation of knowledge and applying that to the right tool. In this case, we've shown the SQL Sentry tool because it's the big entity. It's focusing across weights. It's focusing across system management. It's focusing and identifying and bringing the visibility of the tiering into play. Yeah, not everything is isolated to one function within a stack. And giving it in a way which I saw flexibility. It's not just here's a whole bunch of really strong capability out the box, but you also as a DBA have the knowledge to extend it and really make it focused so that your time is spent doing what really brings good value to your business rather than, and we all know this situation in any IT sector, firefighting is the thing that hurts and costs the most. So thank you both once more. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you, to learn from you. I've learned myself a huge amount. Every day's a learning day, as they say.
That's right.
Taking your experience, as I say, this has been a fantastic series, and certainly for our viewers, we really do hope you find it of really good and strong benefit. And if you've liked anything you've seen on this series of database personas, please reach out to us. Our website, prosperon.co.uk, is certainly a method to contact. We also have a LinkedIn and Twitter location. You can find us on Prosperon. And we also have our YouTube channel, which actually may be where you're watching this video now.